A whole slew of hot seat coaches lost their jobs after last offseason. Whose seat is getting warm now?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, what's up? Happy Friday. Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there. We're your host. This handsome gentleman to my side is Mr. Andy Patton. I'm Isaac Shade, and you're joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day as part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for making this your first listen or watch. Reminder that you can get every single episode ad-free on Amazon Music. And a special shout out goes out to all the everydayers out there and all the great members of the Locked On College Basketball Discord. Man, it's great to have all of you here with us. This episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code Locked On College for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Andy, a fun but kind of conversation today because we're talking about people's livelihoods, and that always makes me feel a little bit icky, if I'm being honest, Andy. But look, it's part of the deal, it's part of the job, and so we do it. We're having an off-season coaching hot seat conversation. What we're going to do is pick one main hot seat coach from each of the Power 5 conferences: ACC, Big 10, Big East, Big 12, and SEC, and one out of all the rest of the mid and low major conferences. And then we'll give you an honorable mention from each one as well. We'll kind of blow through those. And honestly, folks, we'd love to hear from you. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Who else would you pick if not for the choices that we make? And Andy, kind of the lead coming into this is I think we had a little more trouble than we anticipated making our selections, because this time last year, we're saying well, duh, Kenny Payne. Well, duh, Jared Haas. Well, duh, Tony Stubblefield, right? Like there were some obvious ones like that, and a lot of those guys are gone. Kenny Payne, Juwan Howard, Jared Haas, Tony Stubblefield, Jerry Stackhouse, Mike Hopkins, some examples, meaning there aren't really a ton of obvious options right now, which, Andy, at a big picture level is great for our sport because more coaching longevity as players move around and all over the place means the product on court is better. That said, we've gone through and I think made what are some very intentional choices, and we'll frame the conversation and make a lot of sense out of it. Andy, all that, we're going to start with the Big 10. Who did you and I choose from this conference?
The Big 10 was one of the few conferences that I feel like had multiple potential options that we could have gone with, which is kind of funny because it also had quite a few coaching changes this past offseason as well. Of course, Michigan being the most notable one, Ohio State as well. But the coaching change that a lot of people were clamoring for, there was a lot of conversation about this, especially when you factor in that Dusty May ended up going to Michigan as opposed to going to his alma mater, Indiana. That would be, of course, Mike Woodson. And I think at this point, I'm not surprised Mike Woodson didn't get fired after last year, but his seat is definitely getting hotter. Yeah. He went 19-14 last year. He missed the NCAA tournament. He did make it to the NCAA tournament his first 2 years as the head coach of the Hoosiers, but he had a lot of guys who weren't people that he recruited, namely Trace Jackson Davis, who was outstanding, prolific player for Indiana. He goes out the door and suddenly they don't make the NCAA tournament. And I think part of the conversation here, and we'll talk about this a little bit more with some of the other coaches on this list, is when you have what is being deemed a successful offseason, whether it's you have a highly regarded recruiting class, a highly regarded transfer portal class, whatever it may be, you retain a lot of talent, any combination of those things, the pressure builds. And for Indiana, they are loudly being proclaimed as having one of, if not the very best transfer portal class in terms of talent acquisition of anybody in college basketball. They bring in Umar Ballo. They bring in Kenan Carlisle. They bring in Miles Rice. They keep Mackenzie Mbako. Like they have a talented roster. We have talked on the show about concerns about the roster construction. Yeah. And if that ends up becoming an issue where there is floor spacing concerns again for Indiana, they didn't bring in guys who are particularly good three-point shooters. They got Luke Good. They got some guys, but for the most part, this is a team that's probably going to struggle to shoot the basketball. And if they're having issues with floor spacing and it results in them underperforming, the calls for Mike Woodson to lose his job are going to be very loud. They were already pretty loud last year. This is a very proud program at Indiana, as they should be. They do not tolerate missing the NCAA tournament multiple years in a row. I know Mike Woodson is a kind of a storied person within the history of the program, but you got to win basketball games. You got to get to the big dance. And if you make the same mistakes where you build a roster that isn't kind of modern to the current college basketball landscape of being able to space the floor and shoot threes, and you struggle again, I can understand why the fan base and why the larger college basketball space is probably going to start to wonder if he should continue coaching at that program.
I think that's absolutely right, Andy. And you missed the tournament 2 years in a row at Indiana, which they did a bunch in the Archie Miller era there. But it's just like, hey, we didn't do well under Archie. If things don't go well this year, as you said, with that crop that's incoming, and you miss it twice in a row, Indiana fans are desperate to get back. Like it is a joke, a national joke when we have a blue blood conversation and people are like, get Indiana out of there. And so, Andy, I think this is a great call, especially as you said earlier, when a lot of people said last season, we should go ahead and get rid of Mike Woodson right now so we can get Dusty May. And now Dusty May ends up in the same conference at a different school, Andy. And so that's a whole almost just like punch to the gut right there. The honorable mentions that we considered here were Kevin Willard at Maryland and Ben Johnson at Minnesota. We'll see what happens there. Andy, we should probably get on to the Big 12 because we got to keep this train moving. The Big 12 was a little bit difficult for us. We landed, interestingly enough, on Bobby Hurley at Arizona State. Andy, it's an interesting thing because from the 2017-18 season through the 2019-20 season, 3 straight 20-win seasons for Bobby Hurley. But since then, they've had just one 20-win season in the 4 years since. The other 3, Andy, they had 11, 14, and 14 wins. Only one season over Pac-12 play in that 4-year span. Coach Hurley overall has been at Arizona State 9 seasons, just 3 NCAA tournament appearances, Andy, 0 wins. And they were an 11 seed all those years. I can't count the number of times that Arizona State has started well under Bobby Hurley, and then it's just kind of tanked. And here's the thing. That was in the Pac-12. You're coming into the Big 12, and let's be honest, things are going to be more difficult now. What other thoughts do you have about Arizona State this season or Bobby Hurley?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the issue here is that like they were a perfectly adequate team in the middle of the pack in a pretty not great men's basketball conference. Pac-12 hadn't been very good in a long time. Arizona's been great, but other than that, last year was a very prominent example of that. Nobody else was really very good in that conference. Washington State made the tournament. Oregon, of course, made it, but it's not a great basketball conference, or wasn't. And Arizona State just didn't perform all that well. Like you said, 3 NCAA tournaments, 11 seeds, didn't win any of those games. And it's somewhat similar to the Mike Woodson conversation, and we'll talk about it a little bit later with another coach. But when you have a good offseason, like I just said with Woodson, it's going to kind of exacerbate your spot, long-term at the program. Arizona State seems to have had an influx of NIL money. I know Bobby Hurley has done some stuff to try to generate more income for the program. They had a really great recruiting class. Jaden Quintance is the huge name for them in that class. They're a top 10 class, 9th at 24/7 Sports. So they got great incoming talent coming in. They landed some nice players in the transfer portal. They also lost a lot of key talent from last year's team. Frankie Collins is gone. Jemiah Neal is gone. Jose Perez is gone. So I'm really interested to see. But at the end of the day, the issue is this team, as constructed with some of the new talent, probably finishes above 500 in the Pac-12.
Pac-12, that's right.
In the Pac-12. They're not in the Pac-12. Looking at this roster, looking at the talent in the Big 12, this is one of the 5 worst teams in the Big 12. I feel fairly confident in saying that. And that's less about this roster and more about the Big 12 being really, really good. And if Arizona State is behind teams like Cincinnati or Central Florida or a new look BYU team or West Virginia or anything like that, if they're not finishing above that group of teams or and they're below most of them, it's going to be hard to keep Bobby Hurley. Like you might have to be in a situation, and we're going to talk about some other teams that are transitioning conferences. You might be in a situation where you got to say, okay, we need somebody else to lead this program in a new conference. They're going to give Bobby next year. They should give him next year. But yeah, I think his seat is pretty toasty right now.
And Andy, let's be honest. it doesn't help that his brother's sitting on top of the college basketball world right now. That's part of this. And I think the other thing we would ask, and you almost hate to say this because I know there's a lot of proud Arizona State fans out there. Shout out to James Harden. Does Arizona State care enough to pull this trigger? I would say they do. I think, right? Like if it's not going well, but Andy, it's tough.
Yeah, we didn't really have any honorable mentions that were super prominent in the Big 12. That was part of the reason we went with Hurley. Tad Boyle, I don't think he's on the hot seat, but I have a feeling Colorado's not going to be good next year, so I think that seat might start to get a little warmer. Johnny Dawkins shouldn't be on the hot seat, but you never know what's going to happen there. Craig Smith has had success at Utah, but I don't think they're good. Again, similarly to Colorado and Arizona State, I think they're going to struggle with that transition into the Big 12. So it's kind of a tougher conference. I mean, it's a testament to the elite coaching that is in the Big 12 that there are very few coaches who look even remotely like they're going to lose their jobs. We're not going to include new coaches like Steve Lutz or Darian DeVries because they're in their first season at their new program. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with these new schools joining the Big 12. I think that's kind of where you might see some programs. If they really struggle, they might start looking for a new man. Well, Isaac, I want to move on and talk about probably the most obvious candidate on this entire list of 6 coaches that we're going to talk about here, because folks, Villanova is way too proud of a fan base to miss the NCAA tournament 3 years in a row. That means it is time now for Kyle Neptune to put up or get out in Philadelphia. We're going to talk more about that in just a second. But first, I want to tell you all about today's sponsor, Gametime. Going to MLB games in the summer is one of my favorite all-time things. The game, the food, everything that's part of the experience. And I'm excited to make all new memories for the rest of the summer here at the ballpark as we get out of the All-Star break. Thankfully, I don't have to sweat the high-priced last-minute tickets because Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. In fact, prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Again, no MLB for the next couple days as we finalize the All-Star break. But folks, you are in the desert in Las Vegas. You want to go get some NBA Summer League tickets for Friday today, general admission. You can get in for $41 on Gametime. Or if you want to get lower level seats on the sideline, you can get them in the 4th row for under $150.
That's
and
crazy.
If you're somebody who worries about your tickets not being real, you're going to get turned away at the door. It's going to be super embarrassing. One of the great things is Gametime's ticket coverage is covered by the most flexible customer service policy in the entire ticketing industry. So folks, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, Isaac, moving on with our conversation here, talking about a coach on the hot seat in any of the in all of the high major conferences. We talked about Mike Woodson at Indiana. We also talked about Bobby Hurley at Arizona State. Going to move on and talk about the Big East here. And for 2 reasons, this was the easiest decision that we had to make, because Kyle Neptune's pretty notably on the hot seat, as he should be, for some 2 pedestrian seasons at a school in Villanova that does not put up with pedestrian seasons. And 2, pretty much every other coach in the Big East, we do have an honorable mention, but pretty much everybody else in the Big East is locked in. They are either a legendary coach, an incredibly successful coach, or a relatively new coach at their program. So we're not going to see any changes there. It made the Big East pretty easy because Kyle Neptune, he had the unenviable task of replacing Jay Wright at Villanova. That is not easy to do, but Isaac, the early returns have not been good for Coach Neptune over in Villanova.
That's right, Andy. You never want to be the guy after the guy. You want to be the guy after the guy after the guy, right? And so that's unfortunate. And I don't know, sometimes it works well, but more often than not, you want to be the guy after the guy after the guy. Andy, while you were talking, I just did some math. You had mentioned Kyle Neptune has missed the NCAA tournament both years as the head coach of Villanova. In the previous 18 seasons, Jay Wright had missed the NCAA tournament just twice. So they've missed it as many times the last 2 years as they had the previous 18 years. That is everything you need to know right there. Villanova obviously is coming off those championships in 2016 and 2018. This program is so proud. They've got all these dudes in the NBA. It's just like, I want this to happen and I want this to work. but in an era where you can turn this around in one offseason and go blazing, if this doesn't happen in year 3, where again, like we haven't seen a 20-win season, 35 wins for Kyle Neptune, like they had 36 wins back in 2018. So that was more in that one season than Kyle Neptune has combined in his first 2 seasons. Andy, it's got to happen this year, or if not, I'm afraid Kyle Neptune's gone.
Yeah, and it's not even a lack of talent. I mean, you can see with some programs, oh, maybe the NIL is not there, maybe they're struggling with this, so and so. But like they brought in a ton of great players last year, and then most of them didn't perform at expectation, or they have since departed. Hakeem Hart's gone, TJ Bamba's gone, Brennan Howson's gone. Like this is a team that lost a lot of the talent they brought in. We'll see what happens. They get Eric Dixon back. They add Wooga Poplar in the portal. I'm excited about that. But yeah, it is time. Like you have to do it now. He gets a pass for year 1 because they had injuries and because it's the first year after replacing a legend. He gets less of a pass in year 2 because they should have been better than they were last year. Outside of winning Atlantis, they weren't very good. And now it's like there's no more passes. Like this has got to be the year. You got to win 23, 25 games. You got to get an at-large bid or win the Big East. If you're able to pull that off, then you get some job security, especially this year. But it's time for Kyle Neptune. And if it doesn't happen this year, I'd be very surprised if he's retained going forward.
And I know injuries have been a part of both of these years, Andy, but look at UConn last year. Yeah. I don't see Danny Hurley complaining about any of that. They just kept on rolling. So
he might be complaining. He likes to do that, but it didn't slow him down. That's for sure.
Our honorable mention for the Big East is similar to what we've just talked about, and that's Thad Matta, unfortunately, at Butler. If year 3 is the same as year 1 and 2, given the expectations and recent lack of success, it's going to be probably curtains for Thad Matta. No NCAA tournament in either of the first 2 years, no 20-win seasons. Butler last made the NCAA tournament in 2017-18, Andy. That's hard for me to process, but prior to that drought, had made it 10 of the previous 12 seasons. Butler fans and administration are not going to stand for another year of underperforming and no NCAA tournament. Andy, let's move to the ACC, which is funny because we've had a couple perennial hot seaters in Brad Brownell and Kevin Keats. And Andy, I know we're going to get to our pick, but do you think, given how well Clemson did last year, and then the NC State run, which I know triggered a contract clause, and Kevin Keats, gets an extension out of that. That aside, do you think these guys are off the hot seat finally?
I think Brownell for sure is. I mean, he signed an extension, which doesn't always mean, it's not a guarantee by any stretch, but he did sign an extension, or at least it's been reported as we're recording this right now that he's signing an extension through 2029. And for Clemson, it wasn't only that they had success in the NCAA tournament and upset some good teams. It was that they were pretty good throughout the year, and they didn't do that thing that they always do where they struggle in conference play after
we called it Clemsoning last year.
Yeah, they did it a little bit, but not to the extent that they've done it in the past. Whereas Kevin Keats, like, huge hats off to the run that they went on. That was amazing, but that was it. Like the regular season was not good for NC State. And beyond that, this is a team that lost a ton of talent from last year's roster. I think Kevin Keats has cooled off. And I think if this season is similar to last year without the big run, he probably won't get fired, but he'll be right back on the hot seat. Like, I think he kind of earned like an extra year type of situation is sort of my read for NC State. But I think he's definitely not on the hot seat right now because no team wants the PR of firing a coach a year after going on this miracle run the way that they did. But it sets up the ACC to be kind of in an interesting spot because you have a lot of new coaches. You have a lot of coaches in year 2, like at Notre Dame and Syracuse and Georgia Tech. You have some coaches who are not going to get fired because they're incredibly old, like Leonard Hamilton at Florida State, Jim Larinaga at Miami. He's probably not going to get fired anyway because he's had plenty of success. But it kind of sets you up to be in a spot where it's like, who are we going with here? And we've kind of had 2. We're going to go with Mike Young at Virginia Tech, and then our honorable mentions Earl Grant at Boston College. It kind of feels like there's some vague similarities in their 2 situations. But Isaac, what kind of pushed Young to be over the edge and be the top choice here?
Yeah, Andy, in our conversations, we ultimately decided that Young is our pick over Grant simply because of the expectations at Virginia Tech over what they are at Boston College. For example, Virginia Tech under Buzz Williams, who was there right before Mike Young came over from Wofford, 4 straight 20-win seasons, had made 3 straight NCAA tournaments. But in Mike Young's 5 years, they've had just one 20-win season and just 2 NCAA tournaments, neither of which they won a game. They were an 11 seed and a 10 seed. Virginia Tech's record overall is fine, 92-66 in Mike Young's tenure, but they have an overall losing ACC record at 45-48. And it's a similar thing to what we've talked about with some of these other teams. I think Virginia Tech's had some really, really good talent. I've watched Keve Aluma go off in NBA Summer League. You think about guys like Hunter Couture and, some of these other guards that they've had, and it's just like, I thought it was going to work, Andy, because of how well Wofford was doing under Mike Young. But so far, it's just not translated at the same level. I think Virginia Tech's expectations versus the reality of where they are is what, for us, puts Mike Young on the hot seat over Earl Grant.
Yeah, I would agree. And just to kind of put a bow on it quickly and talk about Earl Grant a bit, they lose Quentin Post. That's a huge loss for them. It hasn't been a particularly impressive offseason based on who they've brought in the transfer portal, who they've lost. I recently did an ACC power rankings at USA Today, and I had Boston College last in the ACC. And if they finish completely last in the conference, I think you got to start really looking at it seriously. I think you're right. The expectations are different. And like if Boston College just finishes last and Virginia Tech finishes second to last, I think you're probably more likely to see Mike Young lose his job than Earl Grant. But at the end of the day, both these coaches are in a similar position because you still got to find ways to win basketball games. And I mean, Earl Grant hasn't finished in the top 10 in the ACC in his entire tenure, and he's entering his 4th year. So that's just the kind of thing where it's like, eventually something's got to give. And I think that they're getting close to that spot.
Andy, few coaches can go 0-18 in conference play and keep their job. Tony Stubblefield didn't do it. Dennis Gates at Mizzou did. Will he last another year in Columbia with that same kind of performance? We're going to answer that question and get to our mid-major option in just a second. AP, let's turn our attention to our final Power 5 conference, the SEC, where, Andy, it just means a little bit more than everywhere else in the country. With this one, we had to go with Dennis Gates, who's had 2 years at Missouri, 2 very different years at Missouri, Andy, and similar to, I think about it like a junior in college who's had a great year shooting from 3 and a terrible year shooting from 3. Which one is the reality? And that's what we got to figure out with Dennis Gates. Was the outlier year 1 where the Tigers went 25-10, were ranked in the top 25 and made the NCAA tournament, or last year where they went 8-24 and were 0-18 in the SEC, literally only one of 2 power conference schools to go winless in conference play. Andy, what all comes together in your mind to make Dennis Gates our choice for the SEC hot seat coach?
It's such a fascinating, I would love to, and I'm not about to do this research because I have some semblance of a life, but I would love to look at how many coaches have had that win discrepancy in their first 2 years at a program. Like, that is insane, the difference between how those 2 years have shaped up. But honestly, I feel like a broken record because I'm going to say the same thing I said about Mike Woodson. I'm going to say the same thing I said about Bobby Hurley. Part of the reason that you go 0-18, you should be on the hot seat. So that's pretty obvious. But outside of that, part of the reason that there's some extra pressure here is they've had what has been widely considered and talked about as a really great offseason. Their high school recruiting class is 5th at 24/7 Sports. It's behind only Duke, Alabama, Arkansas, and Rutgers. That is a fantastic place for Dennis Gates and the Tigers to be. Outside of that, they add Mark Mitchell from Duke. They add Tony Perkins from Iowa. Those are 2 top 15 transfers in the entire country, according to Evan Miyakawa's transfer portal rankings. 2 of the best transfers in the country, the 5th best recruiting class in the country, coming off a year where you went 0-18. That is a pretty easy group of reasons to see a coach be on the hot seat. If the program looks remotely like they did in year 1, with all the talent influx coming in, I think he keeps his job. If they go anywhere close to what they were last year, I think you have to make a move, even with his recruiting prowess, even with his transfer portal navigation. Like, you can't stomach going. I mean, they have to win a lot more than 0 games in the SEC next year, certainly for him to keep his job. But it's been a really nice bounce back off season after such a disastrous year. But now it's gotta come together with W's on the basketball court.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. Andy, for our honorable mention here, we're kind of going with Porter Moser. Obviously, one of the things you and I have said is we're really curious to see both for Oklahoma and Texas as the two schools moving in. How does Porter Moser do? How does Rodney Terry do? But Rodney Terry has had more success at Texas than Porter Moser has had at Oklahoma. This is another one of those schools who has not made the NCAA tournament under Porter Moser. They've gone 19-16, 15-17, and did have a 20-win season last year, 20-12. But just Andy dumped the back end of the season, had a great run of an undefeated start to the season all the way through the Jumpman Invitational, got as high as 7th in the country, and then just fell off a cliff. Porter Moser did not have a winning conference record ever in the Big 12, 7-11, 5-13, and then last year 8-10. Andy, I think Porter Moser is going to have to make the NCAA tournament this year to keep things going in Oklahoma. So we'll see what happens there. Let's get to our mid-major conversation, the final one of the day, which, leaves us with 300 or so schools to pick from. And Andy, who have we chosen? I don't know how to use words, Andy. It's the weekend almost. Who are we choosing? I was trying to say choosing and chosen, and that ooh and that doesn't go well together. Who have we picked as our mid-major hot seat coach?
There you go. Yeah, I looked at a handful of different conferences here, trying to pick, higher profile programs. Obviously, there's going to be not tons, but quite a few coaches that are going to lose their jobs this offseason. That just happens every year. There's a bunch of churn at the mid-major levels, but trying to look at some more higher profile programs where that might happen at, and ended up settling on what I think is probably the saddest potential option here out of all the schools we're talking about, and that's Matt McKillop at Davidson. The reason this is so sad is that he took over for his father, Bob McKillop, who was the coach at Davidson for 30 something years, 40 years, close to 40 years. He was there for an incredibly long time, had a ton of success. Now Matt takes over the program. Bob in his final year for Davidson went 27-7, which, what a tough assignment to set up for your kid to have to replace you when you have a 27-win season. They were ranked. They earned a 10 seed in the NCAA tournament. That is all great results for a team in the A10 and a proud program like Davidson. Matt takes over. He goes 16-16 in year one. He goes 15-17 last year. But I think the big concern was not only did they go 15-17, they went 5-13 in the A10. Isaac, Davidson finished 13th out of 15 schools in the A10. This is a program that has a much better track record than that. That is a proud basketball-focused program. You can't finish 13th in the A10 and not be at least on the hot seat, even if you share the last name of an absolute legend at Davidson. I wonder how much more leash he's going to get there. The A10 is very competitive. One of the few teams that finished behind them was St. Louis. They made a coaching change. They bring in Josh Schertz. They're going to be better next year with Robbie Avila in the mix. Davidson has to finish at least top 10 at the minimum, probably top 6, 7 to really have McKillop feel secure in keeping his job. I know the administration, the last thing in the world they want to do is fire him after just a couple of years, but you got to start winning some basketball games at Davidson. That's not a program that puts up with mediocrity the way that they have been the last couple of years.
Andy, dream scenario in my world. Matt McKillop holds on for dear life. Until somebody retires from the NBA, Davidson's most famous alum, and then Steph comes to take the helm at Davidson. That's never going to happen. But, dude, how cool would that be if Steph Curry came back and was the head coach at Davidson? But very seriously, to your point, somebody with the last name McKillop has been the head coach at Davidson since the 1989-90 season. And so, we got to go way, way, way back to when I was 6 to find a non-McKillop head coach at Davidson. So like you said, man, that would be tragic. But unfortunately for Matt, got to get this thing turned around here in the A10.
Last honorable mention very quickly before we move on, since you mentioned him earlier, Archie Miller. Been pretty pedestrian at Rhode Island. You mentioned him having not so much success at Indiana. Would be very interested to see, we're staying in the A10 there, if Archie Miller keeps his job, if it's another average season at Rhode Island. Plenty of other mid-major coaches who are probably coaching their final season this year, but those are the two names to keep an eye on right now. But folks, that is going to wrap it up for us today and for this week here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. I want to thank all of you for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Special shout out to the everyday listeners and those of you who are hanging out with us in our Discord channel. Again, free to join, link in the show notes on audio and video platforms. Have a fantastic weekend, folks. We will be back next week getting you ready with some transfer portal updates, all sorts of fantastic stuff coming your way. Until then, though, as always, apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats, Villanova in particular today. And until Monday, peace out.